Welcome back. Here we are diving into part 3 of our 5-part NASM study guide series. So hopefully parts 1 and 2 gave you guys some clarity on the first 10 chapters. That means we've covered 40% of what you need to know. And if you haven't seen the first 2 videos yet, don't stress. Check out the description for this video. It's going to link you to everything. And if it's your first time with me, my name is Coach Joe Drake. I'm the CEO of the Axiom Fitness Academy, and we are NASM's top preferred partner in the US. We've been running live courses since 2014, and we've worked with thousands of students just like you, and we average above a 94% passing rate. I say that to give you confidence that this video and the rest in this series is going to be as comprehensive as it gets. Today's video is a big one, and what I mean by that is the information that's covered in chapters 11 and 12 is what I would call cornerstone content in the NASM program. You'll have 16 of your 100 questions stem directly from these 2 chapters, and it's also where a lot of concepts from the first half of the book now start to come together and get applied. Before we go through chapter 11, I want to give you a study tip, because if you do it right, this can totally transform how you approach the material, and I want you to pass. First, make sure you print out the study guide so that you can have it out and follow along with some of the main topics. Second, just stay focused. Don't try and multitask while you're watching this video. Make sure you're taking notes and pause the video if you need to. And now we dive in. Chapter 11, Health, Wellness, and Fitness Assessments. This chapter really starts to introduce a lot of assessments and screens that you can do with clients when you're first getting started. You're not going to want to skip out on this stuff, not only because we want to make sure they're actually healthy enough to begin exercising with you, but also because it's your opportunity to really establish a relationship based upon trust and professionalism. Clients will not only appreciate you taking the time to really get to know their body, but it also sets you up better to assess and track progress. First up is the Part Q. You've probably filled this out at a gym before, and this is really seen as the industry minimum standards of what you need to be asking clients before you work out. These 7 questions help to screen them for any major issues and assess their readiness to engage in exercise. The material then goes on to talk more about the health history questionnaire, and this is your opportunity to dive in deeper and find out more about their behavioral and their medical history. These questions not only are going to help you uncover more about their health, but it's also going to give you some good insight into their day-to-day life, which is going to be really helpful when you're trying to figure out how to best coach them. There's a lot in this chapter, so I'll say that over time, you're going to get better at paring down what you really need to talk about on day 1. As you continue to work your way through this chapter and chapter 12, it's going to become pretty obvious that you're not going to be able to assess and address all of these in your first day, especially if they haven't signed up to train with you yet. Sometimes the hardest part about coaching is actually knowing what not to talk about or address yet. When it comes to the health history questionnaire, NASM actually does give you guys some documents on this that you can use, but don't be afraid to add more questions for yourself if you feel like it's stuff you want to know. And as we dive into the actual assessments that NASM goes through, one of the first things you want to do is think about your sequencing of assessments. If you're going to run someone through things like a body composition test, a blood pressure test, and maybe doing things like performance and strength tests, some of those will impact one another, so you're going to want to make sure that you have them in the right order. The first assessment is resting heart rate, and the material does talk about a couple of different ways that you can manually perform this. But I'll tell you right now, if you do go about testing resting heart rate in your first session with a client, you might not get a real resting rate. You can definitely still do it, and honestly, I really like this one because this is a number that will change pretty quickly for a lot of people if they haven't been working out. But personally, I prefer to rely more upon things like connected heart rate monitors or maybe a digital option. Next up is blood pressure, and for this assessment, it's probably less important that you really know how to perform it. It's a great skill if you do, but you want to focus more on understanding the ranges as people come in. And I say not to focus so much on how to perform it because taking blood pressure is a skill. And it's not really one we spend a lot of time in these early stages teaching you guys how to do. So if you do want to do it, it can be a valuable measure, but I would advise just investing in an automated blood pressure cuff. As we move into this next section on anthropometry, I just want to say I really like this section, not only because we start to get into some really great things to track and showcase changes for our clients, but it's also a really good opportunity to start to educate them on the impact of strength training as we gain muscle. BMI, or body mass index, gets a lot of mixed reviews, but it's still a really commonly talked about metric in the medical community. Now, you probably know that BMI may be a little bit less helpful when we're looking at individuals with a lot of muscle mass, But for the research in the medical community, when they're looking at data points with thousands of people, this is great information. Either way, whether you like it or not, you're gonna wanna make sure that you're familiar with the different ranges in the BMI categories. In today's technological age, circumference measurements can seem a little outdated, but I wanna tell you guys, this might be one of your most versatile and helpful assessments for a lot of clients. It obviously doesn't give us body composition, but it does tell people what is changing and where. And isn't that what people want? It's also inexpensive and convenient. There are some really great advanced ways of getting body composition, but the equipment can be a little bit harder to come by or it can be expensive. This pretty easy to get accurate at, and you can take it with you anywhere. So make sure that you're familiar with waist circumference, waist to hip ratio, and the other common measurements. Now for body composition, let's talk about skin fold measurements. This one may be less common in a lot of gyms because of the high level of skill and practice that it takes to become accurate. I can tell you personally that it can be a really great skill if you become good at it, but it's not one that you can learn on your own. So your takeaway for the exam is you want to make sure that you have a basic understanding of the theory behind this, and that you're also familiar with the Jackson and Pollock as well as the Dernan and Wolmersley sites. Another common method for body fat testing you've probably used is bioelectrical impedance. And the basic premise is that muscle and lean tissue are better conductors of electricity than fat. It has its sources of error, but it's relatively user-friendly and is more and more common in a lot of gyms. Underwater weighing sounds kind of medieval, but for a long time this was considered the gold standard of body fat testing. The only problem is that if you're really going to do it, you literally have to make yourself feel like you're drowning, which I can tell you really sucks. It's rare to find these days, but it relies upon Archimedes' principle, which put simply just means that denser tissue like muscle is going to weigh more than fat underwater. And as we move into the cardiovascular assessments, I just want you guys to know these aren't tested on as heavily or in as great of depth. So if I were you, I would work to have recognition level knowledge of things like the YMCA step test and the Rockport walk test. This is one of those areas where you can probably read it once and understand at the level that you need to, knowing that as you start working with clients, you can always come back to the book as a reference. As for the talk test, which truthfully I find the most useful, you not only want to have a good understanding of how to perform it, but you also want to have an idea of how to identify VT1 and VT2 based on the assessment and their breathing rate. That wraps up the most important concepts for chapter 11. And as we move into chapter 12, if I had to weight the amount of time and energy that you put into both chapters, it's definitely going to be in chapter 12. Mastering the movement assessments and really understanding the concepts of overactive and underactive just take more time, repetition, and practice, so let's do it. In order to really understand and apply the assessments, we need to make sure that you have a good understanding of what NASM means by muscle imbalance. The easiest way of thinking about it is every joint and area of our body is governed by agonist and antagonist relationships, and these muscles on both sides have to work together. It's not uncommon because of life or injuries or overuse to have big discrepancies in strength from one side to the other, and this is going to have an impact on how we move. And before we dive into the movement side of things, it can be beneficial to have an understanding of what's going on when we're just at a static position. This is what's covered inside of the static postural assessments. This means not only learning what to look for, the checkpoints that NASM talks about with your static postural assessments, but also how it might relate to imbalances. And I say might because it doesn't automatically mean that there's a muscular imbalance, but it does give us a reason to look further into it. So in addition to memorizing the kinetic chain checkpoints for your anterior, your lateral, and your posterior view, you also want to make sure you know the three major postural distortion patterns. This is going to be pes planus syndrome, your upper cross syndrome, and your lower cross syndrome. In addition to recognizing each of those, you want to make sure you know the potential overactive and underactive muscles that also go along with. And now for the big one, the overhead squat. I won't even pretend to dive deep inside the overhead squat in this video because we have a full 30-minute video that teaches you the entire thing, but you're going to want to spend some time mastering this. Unfortunately, this does mean memorizing most of the overhead squat solutions table, and that means the checkpoints of what to look for as well as the possible overactive, underactive muscles. Don't try to just learn this from the book though. You're going to want to get active, video yourself, and go through it to bring this to life. And the same goes for the single leg squat and the push-pull assessments. I find these ones are a little bit easier to learn because there are fewer checkpoints you have to look for and they're easier to perform. I do like the addition of the single leg squat and the push-pull assessment though, because what happens is if you're going to perform these assessments, you'll start to find certain things that show up in each of these assessments, giving you reason to do more than one. And again, just a reminder, you're gonna have a much easier time learning these if you step away from the computer, practice on yourself or other people in the gym. As for the performance assessments that are talked about in this chapter, definitely spend some time reviewing them, but just know they're not gonna be tested over as much as you find with the movement assessments and the static posture. Chances are you're gonna learn them at the depth that you need to if you're consistent with taking those section quizzes and then reviewing the things that you don't know. Beyond just the chapter material, make sure that you're being thoughtful and strategic about the assessments that you're gonna use once you are certified. Not every assessment's gonna make sense for or even be safe for some clients to perform, so make sure you err on the side of caution and only utilize assessments that you yourself are very comfortable with. And that's it for part 3 of our 5-part study guide. The goal for this video and the others in this series are to help you narrow down what actually matters. Now it's time to get to work learning it. So make sure and take your time and go through the description that we included in this video. We put a lot of additional links and resources and in-depth education on all the things I just talked about. So make sure and go through those links and I'll see you in part 4.